Wow. Would that we all were appreciated and missed and our contributions articulated so well when our time comes. I didn't know Mariana personally, and listening to the tributes here today, I really wish I had. I have an excuse. I'm based in Brisbane, and although I think I must have met her very briefly, we didn't have a relationship to speak of, but she was certainly well known and well admired. I'm particularly pleased and a little surprised, but pleased that so many people here today have said that they believe she's watching us here today. That's something I would have said, and I'm glad that others have said it with me. She absolutely would be. She's in a better place, but not very far from us. A few old faces here today, well, faces from the past, Moira, of course, and also Brian Dickinson. Now, Brian, where is he? Up there. Brian won't remember me, but we had some contact many years ago when he was still living in New Zealand. So it was done by letter back then. This is in the pre-email days, probably pre-fax. But it's great to see him here, and hopefully we can catch up briefly afterwards. Perhaps it's different on other worlds, but there is something in our human condition that makes us uncomfortable with confronting reality. We avoid thinking about death, for example, many of us, even though we know it's inevitable. Many of us struggle to manage life without ever considering how we came to be here. Where did we come from? And what's it all about, really? I was talking to someone here earlier about the age group of people who attend UFO conferences and meetings. And it's basically, in my experience, about 40 plus. So congratulations to anyone here, and I can see a lot of you who are under 40. But I think the underlying reason is that it's not until you start getting a little bit older and that you start questioning, well, hang on, I've been doing this and I'm doing that. You know, one day I'm going to die and stop paying taxes. What was that all about? Almost all of us, even us, have a well-earned PhD in reality avoidance. Now, I have to qualify that not as much, however, as those, excuse me, in our society who still deny the reality of the UFO phenomenon. But many of us still avoid simple truths, even when they're staring us in the face. Now, I've been involved in the field for many years, more than I really want to admit here. And unlike many of my fellow ufologists, present company excluded, I was never content with reading about lights in the sky, even craft in the sky. I mean, it's fantastic, but how many hundreds, thousands of good reports by observers like policemen, pilots, astronauts, cosmonauts, astronomers do we need before accepting that something not made on Earth is flying around our planet? How many thousands of photographs and movie films showing these things have to be made before we take them seriously? How many more ground tracers and metal samples do we need? How many more whistleblowers from the intelligence and military services need to break their silence before we accept what is happening? Now, in 2018, there are reasons that, to me, are very obvious why the UFO research community has not moved forward as much as many of us would hope. And I'll be discussing those shortly. Where's my little clicker?
So it's
The top one?
no, it's the arrow forward.
Okay.
Oops,
Oh.
too far.
What was that? I was always perplexed, for example, at the muted response from the UFO community, which continues, incidentally, when Colonel Philip Corso told his story in the book The Day After Roswell. He saw the bodies from the Roswell crash. He handled recovered items from the crash and helped seed them into various industries to exploit the technology. Here was someone who, no question, worked in the Pentagon. This was the sort of disclosure that the UFO community talked about wanting and prayed for every night. And yet we dithered, we questioned, we argued, and we didn't embrace what he revealed. Now he's gone. I think the universe saw that we weren't ready for the rest of his story. We didn't deserve it, because he wrote a second book called Dawn of a New Age, telling the rest of the story from his years in the military. That was never published before he died. It's amazing stuff. If you get a chance to find it, it's still unpublished. So when someone credible says that one of these craft landed and that a person emerged, I want to know more. I want to know if what they report is real, or are they delusional? Someone who wants attention, fame, money for the story. Were there witnesses? Is there any evidence besides the story? And so on. The idea, this is something I think we have to wrap our minds around, the idea of contact with someone or something from another world is just about the most powerful concept that we can imagine. It ties in with our culture and our belief systems in very uncomfortable ways in many cases. And it's understandable, raise your hand if my voice starts dropping. It's understandable that it has appealed to a whole spectrum of people. Now they range from total nut jobs who should be in asylums, to attention seekers, to con men and opportunists, and I'm going to name one of these people in a minute, right through the spectrum to people of intelligence and integrity who have simply told what they experienced and not tried to profit from it or make money from the experience. In some cases, these people had eyewitnesses with them confirming their claims. And some have photographs and movie film or even physical artifacts confirming the reality of what they experienced. My own field research, I love to travel, and so I have tried to incorporate that love of travel with UFO investigation, and that began some years ago after I read a third-hand account of an encounter that took place back in 1940, and it was published in a very obscure book, and that was, I'm sorry, okay. I've just got a note here to add an image, and I haven't added it. And that's not Brian's fault, Paul's fault. That's mine, because I haven't got it yet. A man named Udo Wartener was working as a young man. He was about to get married, so he was in his late 20s. and he was working at a mine in Montana in the northwest of the USA. And one morning he heard a humming sound, and so he climbed up out of the mine shaft and found a disc approximately 100 feet in diameter hovering just over the ground. And of course, you have to get your mind around this fact. 1940, no one had flown in space. No satellite had ever been launched. And so this was totally unfamiliar territory, and he at first thought it must be some kind of a blimp. Anyway, as he kept watching, a walkway lowered from beneath it, and a man came walking down, nicely dressed and looking very friendly and normal, and walked up to him and said, "We're sorry, we didn't realise anyone was in this area." Isn't that a nice way to begin a contact apology? But he asked him if it was okay if they took some of the water from the stream nearby. And he couldn't see any reason why not, so he said sure. And a large tube device came from the craft and went into the stream and sucked water out of it for about the next 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, Udo talked with this man and another man who came out of the craft, and eventually they invited him on board, showed him around. He saw the engines, the propulsion system, didn't understand very much of what he saw, but they explained everything, and they let him ask any question he wished, except they said, "We will not discuss your beliefs because we cannot interfere in any way." And one of the comments that I found most intriguing was that they lived among us from time to time to monitor our progress or otherwise, and to help where help was able to be given. So I travelled over to the western states of the US, started off in Oregon. Udo was dead. He passed away in the late 60s, I think it was, from memory. But I was able to meet his best friend, who was still alive, and who was the first person he told his experience to. His daughter, who remembered it vividly. I was able to track down his handwritten account that he wrote of the event, which is fascinating. His son is a pilot for Delta. His daughter works in the university, very stable, middle of the road, credible people, and none of them could speak more highly of his integrity. In other words, if he said he saw something X, then it happened. And as a result of getting correct information out about this experience into the UFO field, is now regarded as one of the most credible, if not the most credible, pre-Roswell cases. 1932. And this involved a man called Leo Dworshak. Has anyone come across the name? Okay, just 3 or 4 of you. Leo and his younger brother Michael encountered a large craft that landed regularly in a field not far from their home. And they used to observe it, and they observed men coming out of the craft and walking around looking at the ground. And they weren't able to get closer because there was some sort of an invisible barrier stopping them. But as this continued over several months, the barrier gradually weakened until they were able to go right up, and eventually they met the men. So the men were able to speak to them, just as Udo was able to speak in English. The people on the craft had no problems with communication. In Leo's case, they were brought up in a German-speaking family. Their family background was German. Again, 1932. And so they had a series of contacts with the same crew that lasted for over 30 years. And unlike Udo, Leo wrote a book about it. It's just a small book, very plainly written. And when I went over to Montana, I had arranged, I'd been in contact with him through email, and when I went over, he died just a few weeks before I arrived. It happens, unfortunately, with a lot of the people I go to visit. So be worried if I contact you. But I was able to meet his daughter, other people that he knew, and I came away with absolutely overwhelming feeling of certainty that what happened, what he said happened to him and his brother happened. His book, by the way, if anyone wants to try and track it down, you can find it online. It's called UFOs Are With Us. You can take my word. Leo Dworshak. My next major research effort, and I'm only going through this because I think it illustrates, firstly, the scale of what is happening around the world. It's not an American phenomenon. It's not a Western culture phenomenon. It's worldwide, and it happens to people in all parts of the world. Language barriers stop us from hearing about some of the most interesting. And my next effort was the amicizia. Now, if anyone here speaks Italian, I'm probably saying it wrong, but it means friends, because this is the name of a case that began in Europe in 1956, involved hundreds of people, diplomats, engineers, university professors, politicians, theologians, housewives, and so on. It is, as far as we know, the largest and longest running case of alien contact ever. And it wasn't restricted to any one country, although a focus was Italy. And it remained under the radar, even in the UFO field, for many years until Stefano Breccia, who is a professor, computer professor in Italy, he broke the story with his book, Mass Contacts. Now, I helped him, before he passed away, I helped him. You thought I was joking, didn't you? I helped Stefano Breccia edit his second book. The first book was horribly edited. He didn't have anyone to help him, and I helped him edit the second one, which came out, and it's amazing. By the way, the case is still going on. It hasn't ended. And this book was, I believe, the first time that photographs taken inside of the interior of an alien craft or a craft from another world have ever been published. I'm also now, and I'll just mention this briefly, involved in an investigation into a Brazilian case where a man was accidentally taken to another planet by an alien team who was here taking vegetation samples. Oops, indeed. He awoke on that world, and it took him some time to accept that he was no longer on Earth. He thought he'd been kidnapped and taken to Russia or something. This was back in the 50s. Altogether, he spent 8 days on this planet, learning a great deal about the people, their beliefs, and their history before they brought him back to Earth, very apologetically. Now, when he got back, he wrote a very detailed, almost hour-by-hour account. It's over 400 pages of very small writing about what he had experienced and seen. and I've been working on this one for several years. I'm convinced it's real. He has also passed away, but seems to be becoming a sub-theme. But his family is still around, his children, and so I'm heading to Brazil hopefully next year to get into that one a bit more. But now, enter another person who's a Frenchman now living in Japan, Michel Zirger. Now, until a few years ago, I'd never heard of him. He was born and raised in France, and when he was a small boy, his mother saw a craft very close up, hovering just outside their apartment window. That instilled the fact that he knew she wouldn't lie to him. He didn't see it himself, but that instilled in him a fascination for the subject. And so, again, we come up with this problem of the language barrier. His English is mediocre, but I have helped him edit his books. He also publishes in Japanese, French, and Italian. So I've been helping him with the English versions. And that was the first book I helped him with. It's The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson, a name that will be familiar to most of you who have been in the field for a long time. But I venture to say that most of you, like me, knew very little about him. He's a rather mysterious, unknown figure. I had read some of his books, but the man himself remained elusive. And what happened was that Michel Zirger spent years acquiring his original documents, his diaries, his journals, his photos, his family Bible, photos that he had taken. And what emerges, and I'm not here to sell books because I don't have any copies of this with me, but what emerges is a man of great integrity, unique abilities, and someone who travelled on a very unusual and unique road, quite different from Adamski. But he was involved with Adamski when Adamski had his first major encounter with extraterrestrials in the desert, and George Hunt Williamson and his wife were among the witnesses to that event. So when George Hunt Williamson says, yes, along with 5 other witnesses, we clearly saw a strangely dressed man talking with Adamski in the desert, in the daytime, at fairly close range, and that he also saw the mothership above, and we also saw the smaller craft flying around, that certainly gets my attention. That's a picture of George Hunt Williamson. That was when he was living in Peru for a number of years. Zirger has been led to conclude, and this is kind of the motif of this presentation. So I want to read it to you. For the last 50 years, we have been led by the nose by a small clique of astronomer, statistician, ufologists, allegedly rigorous, who have led ufology down a blind alley to where it is at present. All have in common that they rejected, in one way or another, the contactees. I chose this quote because it encapsulates what has happened within mainstream ufology over the last half century. In his books, and I can recommend them to you, not because I helped him edit them, but because they are groundbreaking, new material. He doesn't hesitate to name names, explain motives, and show how and why ufology has arrived on its present plateau. Helping him edit the books led to my own reappraisal of the contactees some years ago. I first experienced, in my involvement with MUFON, which is the largest civilian UFO organization in the US, and incidentally, China is the country that has the largest UFO group in the world. So if you ever go to China, you'll find, and even in Hong Kong, you'll find very large groups. We had a fellow called Professor Sun Shi Li. I see a nod of recognition there, speaking throughout the world, and very fine man. Too bad he didn't speak English, but that's okay. He spoke Spanish, and so we had it translated into English. So, reading the books by Michel Zirger forced me to begin to reevaluate the biases in ufology and some of the things I saw firsthand in the leadership and at all levels, right from the very top down in MUFON, disturbed me. And over the years I watched, as many of you have, abductions begin to almost succeed in abducting ufology. So here's my take on the whole abduction scenario. Do abductions take place? Yes. In fact, Leslie and I had one this morning getting here. Google abducted us. No, seriously, yes, abductions do take place. Are some of the greys actually aliens? Some, yes. But most are androids built by aliens. And I'll go to battle with anyone on that aspect. Some of the abductions are actually staged events by humans to generate a new narrative to divert ufology and the public away from the great reality. And still others have then aided and assisted the abduction aspect to divert ufology from where it should be. Now, this is what I wrote some time ago, and it was published. It's time to name and shame. I didn't write that. This is what I wrote. Along with many other researchers, I found, for example, that the stories from one of the most quoted figures in the field, Whitley Strieber, were merely opportune science fiction that has contributed to the move away from science fact. Now, I hope no one's passing out or fainting on the floor. That was the book that brought huge attention to Whitley Strieber, and it had some positive effects also in the sense that many people came forward with their own stories. There's a funny story, though, about that image. Has anyone ever seen a grey that looks like that? Let me read to you something that Bud Hopkins, rest his soul. If any of you here ever met him, you'll know that he was a wonderful, upright, honest, open person. And I wrote to Bud Hopkins, this is going back to 2006, after he exposed the information that in writing this book, Bud Hopkins helped him get it into print. And I want to quote Bud Hopkins here. Sorry, I want to quote what I wrote to Bud Hopkins about how he mentioned Strieber's intense excitement at the completion of the painting for the front cover because it was, quote, exactly like the faces he had seen, and also that it was the same face. Whitley could not stop talking about the way the artist had accurately caught the silhouette of the alien's face. Bud Hopkins then informed Whitley Strieber, this is before the book came out, that his accurately portrayed alien was totally different from any other ever reported. And the reaction of Whitley Strieber was then quite remarkable. He suddenly did an about face and said, yes, you're right. As I recall, the head was different and blah, 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 and he retrieved his memory suddenly. And this is after someone claimed that this fellow lived in his house with him for days and did this and did that. So, bottom line is, I'm not here to attack someone. Well, I am, when they go off the tracks and cause a lot of damage. But Whitley Strieber is a brilliant science fiction writer, but there's no doubt that he has attempted basically to just use almost every facet of ufology. Think about it. Roswell, abductions, cover-ups, hidden memories, missing time, implants, Hale-Bopp, remember the alien craft accompanying the Hale-Bopp comet? It's all fodder for a very good science fiction writer, but that's all it is, science fiction. But don't take it from me. The one person on Earth who's presumably closer to Whitley Strieber than anyone else, his wife, Anne, affirmed to multiple people when they were here in Brisbane. We brought them over to speak at the International UFO Conference in 1999. And in the presence of multiple people, she said, everything he has ever written is fiction. So I sent that in my email to Bud Hopkins, and I'm not going to read all of this, I'm just going to read a couple of sentences. This is Bud Hopkins' take on it. Strieber is unable to tell fantasy from reality. His grasp on truth was highly tentative. I have often referred to his books as constituting a new genre, which I call involuntary fiction. Without any outside corroboration, virtually nothing he claims should be accepted as true, and most researchers have long been aware of this fact. And that's true. I should have brought a copy of an email I got from David Jacobs, whose name will be familiar to many of you. A professor who's done a tremendous amount of work, university professor, who's done a lot of work in analysing cases. And then he closes with this sentence. Strieber is bad news for serious research, the ultimate loose cannon, and personally a profoundly unhappy, emotionally confused individual. So that was in 2006. I promised I would not distribute that or publicise it in any way while he was still alive, but now that Bud has passed on to that great mothership up in the sky, I feel comfortable in revealing it, and I have published it. So yes, you can quote me on that. Unfortunately, Strieber's not alone. Now, when you have an unregulated field, that means that oxygen is being given to increasingly bizarre claims that are presented without any evidentiary support. Now, let's give a couple of names here. We listen to outrageous claims from people like Michael Wolff. I think he's been totally debunked, and he's now passed on as well. And currently Corey Good, I don't know if any of you are familiar with his galactic adventures. But they provide nothing, and I mean nothing, by way of support. The situation in 2018 is little better than it was 2 or 3 decades ago. So the mainstream groups, including MUFON, but many others, they remain largely fixated on sightings of objects whizzing around the sky and endless speculations about what it might mean. Charlatans abound. So no wonder ufology has failed largely to attract the scientific community or provoke the media to break from its constraints to cover the story of the millennium. So fraudulent cases and claims, many of them. So let's come back to reality. George Adamski. Now, there was a time not too many years ago that I would roll my eyes at the very mention of George Adamski's name. To me, it was almost self-evident that, you know, they were cranks. He and the others in his day were cranks, that they manipulated a naive public in the 1950s and 60s. And that changed when I came across something back in 2012, I think it was. And I published this as an article which some of you might have seen in Nexus magazine called Adamski's Forgotten Photograph. So let me just quickly take you through that. Do we still have time?
What is it?
10 to 3. So round 3, okay. This is Desert Center in California today. It's a good image, actually. Adamski and 7 friends traveled into the desert because he had a hunch that if they prepared themselves and went there, that they might have a sighting. And this all happened on the 20th of November, 1952. Now, the first thing that happened early in the afternoon was that they saw a very large cigar-shaped ship sailing overhead. Very high, but they could see the details. Large ship flying over, but then military aircraft flew over very low. And then the mothership, as we assume it was, vanished in a very quick vertical climb. Adamski set up his telescope and attached his camera and saw a flash in the sky, and immediately a small craft was descending nearby. Now, all of them saw this. It's not just something Adamski saw. The whole group saw it. So Adamski, using his telescope, which was quite a decent one, actually, even today, he hurriedly snapped off his 7 photographic plates so quickly that he didn't focus too well on the camera's ground glass finder. This is before they had any automatic focusing. And the craft came to a stop about half a mile away from the group and remained just above the ground, but behind a little rock outcrop, and only the top was visible. So with the 7 plates now exposed and put safely in his jacket pocket, Adamski began taking photographs with his Brownie camera. Now, despite the name of the camera and despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact that it was so common, the old box Brownie was actually quite a decent camera, if anyone here is a photographer. It had a ground glass lens in a day when any cheaper cameras were generally plastic. And it was fixed focus, so pretty much everything you photographed came out sharp. And so his first impulse was to photograph the craft, which was now barely visible behind this small hill. It then moved again until it was completely out of view. So he took 2 more images to record the terrain. And then a few minutes later, he suddenly noticed someone standing in the distance, motioning for him to approach. Orthon, as he was later called, had arrived. Now, the story of this encounter, witnessed by the 7 witnesses who were there, a short distance from Adamski, the footprints that were left behind and photographed, and plaster of Paris casts taken is well known, and it's well accessible to anyone who doesn't know the story. But I want to jump ahead to something that transpired a little bit later that same afternoon. After Orthon left and the craft left, which they all saw again, the group spent several hours making plaster of Paris casts of the footprints and didn't leave until these were safely dried. Now I'm going to read what Adamski said. George, which is George Hunt Williamson, and Al Bailey asked permission to give a report to an Arizona newspaper, and I granted it. They decided to drive to Phoenix since that was the closest large city, whose papers would probably have the greatest coverage. They asked me a number of questions to help them in the report, one of which was, how large was the saucer? I answered about 20 feet, but I was still in a daze and did not recall actually noticing how large it was. I noticed the details, but not the overall. But to substantiate the report, I gave them a couple of the film holders with exposed film for the newspaper to finish and use if they desire. So the 2 Williamsons and the 2 Baileys, husband and wife in each case, met with reporters of the Phoenix Gazette newspaper, major newspaper in that part of the world. The paper took a photograph of the 2 couples looking at the negatives and went ahead and developed the negatives themselves. 4 days later, the article appeared. Now, the couples invited reporters to go and visit the site and see the footprints for themselves, but they didn't. But it was a spectacular story and guaranteed to sell papers. And this is where the story takes us into a strange collision of worlds. Here is the front page, the beginning of the report. It continues on another page, but here is one of the photos that the newspaper developed. It's a close daytime photograph. It shows a well-defined structured craft at an oblique angle slightly above the camera. Perspective seems consistent with a craft in descent mode. The 3-ball landing gear is actually clearly visible. It's slightly unfocused, which fits George Adamski's claim that he made the exposures without taking time to focus properly. But it doesn't detract from the fact that the photograph, even by 2018 standards, is impressive. Here's a close-up from the newspaper of the saucer. Now, how do we account for this? How does a simple con man, as Adamski's detractors claim he was, produce such an image? He took it outdoors in front of 7 witnesses. There was no opportunity to know what he had captured, or even if he had captured anything at all. There was no chance for him to pull off some sort of manipulation during processing, even if that was possible in this pre-digital period, 1952. Adamski himself never saw the photograph until it appeared on the front page of the newspaper. But despite staring the UFO community and skeptics in the face, this image has essentially been ignored, even by the few people who have attempted to deal with this first contactee, as Adamski is often termed. Of course, he wasn't actually the first, he was just the best known. So, my message to you and to myself is we need to reevaluate that early period in his personalities. Look at the newly obtained documentation and these facts about Adamski and his original claims. They have to be faced, not ignored. The inescapable fact that this photo was made in daytime in front of witnesses, independently developed by a newspaper, and clearly shows, well, I don't know about you, but that doesn't look like a bird. To me, it doesn't look like a cloud or some sort of a shadow. It doesn't look like a balloon. It's clearly something that is from another place, and I think that requires us to reconsider the claims of Adamski and those associated with him. And so this realization was the turning point in my conversion, because along with most people in the UFO field, I had come to reject his claims as ludicrous and laughable. I was wrong. When we return, I'll be going into some new developments that most of you will not be aware of, and about these photos that I think you'll find very exciting. All right, so I just want to return and refresh our minds, because I think this is crucial of what Michel Zirger said, because this is speaking to us. For the last 50 years, we've been led by the nose. And all of these people have in common that they rejected, in one way or another, the contactees. Okay, so after the book by George Hunt, about George Hunt Williamson, was published, I then helped him, this is over a period of several years, edit his second book, We Are Here. Now this one I cannot recommend to you more highly. This is seminal, pivotal material. You can buy it through Amazon now. I don't have any copies here to show you. But this is, the title, We Are Here, is something that a person from afar wrote in French on a piece of paper to Michel in one of his encounters. And he's had 2 encounters of his own in Tokyo, and always had a witness present, at least one witness present. Now this book is destined to become a classic, and I think eventually it's going to help reshape ufology. Notice the red, can you all see that down the back? Includes the first ever photo of the extraterrestrial man, Orthon. Now this, Michel Zirger got a professional portrait artist to come up with a picture of the man that they met in one of these encounters. And this is the man, and remember, he was with someone who saw the man, someone who incidentally doesn't believe in UFOs even now. But this is the man, and although he did not announce who he was, we think there's a possibility, quite a good possibility, that this is Orthon. Anyway, you have to read the book to get the full story. You just simply can't do justice to something like that in just a short presentation like this. Then, without any warning, last September, let's see, September last year, now that we're in October, 2 major things happened in quick succession in my life. Firstly, a new document was leaked in the US that some of you might have read about. It relates to the Aztec crash. Now, this took place in New Mexico and was rapidly debunked and poo-pooed. And this was a document released by two men who claimed to be retired military personnel and were nearing the end of their life and wanted to get the truth out. And so they leaked the documents of this report. Many of you would have seen the MJ documents, Majestic documents, MJ-12. Well, this was a presidential briefing document. This was a document prepared, if it's authentic, prepared for George W.H. Bush, the first Bush. It's dated to 12 days before his inauguration. Anyway, you can find it on the internet now in high resolution scans. It's about 15, 20 pages long. In that document, it reveals what they claim actually happened with the Aztec crash. Firstly, the craft came down late afternoon in an isolated farm. It was damaged and came in rather heavily. And when the authorities got there, they were able to break into it eventually and found the bodies of several small beings in what was obviously the control part of the craft. But it's quite large, it was 99 feet in diameter. Below deck, they found a series of capsules that turned out to have bodies in most of them. And at first they didn't realize that these bodies were actually in stasis. They were in a state of cryogenic suspension. That was something that was totally beyond Earth science back then. So no one had any experience. But they were able to revive two small infants who looked completely human and a completely normal human-looking man. And when the man was revived, they were taken into protective custody. He spoke English, no problems. And a large part of the briefing document is extracts from hundreds and hundreds of pages of interviews that they held with him, interrogations with him before he was returned to his people the following year. So I'm reading through this and it's fascinating stuff. If you want to read something new and you haven't seen this, get it. But something made my eyeballs pop out because the man made the claim that his people had been visiting the Earth for thousands of years. And the interrogator, the military intelligence interrogator, queried their lifespan. And this led into a discussion, and the alien man, because he was extraterrestrial, they found that he had anyway, some of his internal organs were a little bit different from ours. But he said, you know, there's thousands of proofs on the Earth that we've been visiting. I'm just paraphrasing here. And he mentions he mentions two, but one of them, he said, is that if you go to the island that you call the Isle of Pines in the South Pacific, you'll find there the remains of a concrete landing platform that we built 115 of your centuries ago. That's about 11,500 years. And I'm sitting there and I thought, it's a 2-hour flight from Brisbane. I think it's about 2.5 from Sydney.
It's a great carnival cruise.
Or you can cruise like those who have unlimited wealth. And I thought, you know, I knew from my reading and research over the years that New Caledonia has been like a black spot as far as reports go. In fact, I only have come across one sighting, which was a landing of a craft on the beach and some contact many years ago, back in the 70s, I think. But otherwise, you know, you never heard about New Caledonia when it came to UFOs. And so Mr. Google became very busy. I soon discovered that there was, in fact, a mystery, an archaeological mystery on the Isle of Pines. And so I began investigating it. I flew over there and quickly established, it wasn't very hard, that these structures exist. Now, in the middle of the island of Pines, I don't know if anyone's been there, but you know, you can go there and never hear about this or know about this, but in the middle of the island there's a plateau called the Iron Plateau. And it's called the Iron Plateau because it's made of iron. Globules of iron, most of them about marble size, but they go all the way up to room size boulders, but it's all very, very rich iron ore. And fortunately it hasn't yet been mined. They've been mining nickel and manganese on the main island, but on the Isle of Pines it hasn't been mined. But on this plateau there's over 300 structures. Now they're built like a mound. They are anything up to 10, 15, 20 meters across. They are generally 1.5 to 3 meters tall. And inside them is a concrete block. And so I'm reading all of this before I went over there, and I thought, well, you know, why haven't I heard about this? And so I went over there and I found out that back in the 60s, a French archaeologist in Noumea had a report come to him that workers were demolishing one of these mounds to make a new road. And all of a sudden, they hit concrete. And they tried dynamite and everything. It was very, very hard. Okay, so anyway, if you read Nexus, I published an article on that back in May this year. I think it's May, June issue. Dealing with what I found so far over there. Now, first of all, the concrete is real. This is the actual concrete block. It's weathered because it's been out in the open now for 50-something years. And this hole was created by the dynamite, but I've seen other blocks and they're quite regular. Now, the official explanation for these is that they were made by prehistoric birds who, how do I say this politely? Shat or crapped or passed concrete. I'm sorry. So anyway, I managed to find some local men, had to pay them exorbitant amounts of money to start digging around underneath. Now, if you get the article in Nexus, it has a diagram that was drawn by the archaeologist, the French archaeologist. Now, there's this rectangular block of concrete. In this case, you can see how tall it is. It's about 7, 8 feet high, so over 2 meters. It's actually a bit lower than the photo shows. Underneath is a triangle ice cream cone shaped metal object pointing downwards. And it shows this in the diagram. So I thought, well, you know, maybe some giant dodo type bird did a very big bowel movement. The nodules of iron stuck in the concrete must have been rather rough on his interior. But wouldn't it be interesting to go and find out what's happened to this metal triangular object underneath? So that's where things are. I went back in January this year and made another discovery, which wasn't reported by anyone. not by this archaeologist, there's actually a perfectly circular hole in the top about where his foot, the one on the left, is. The hole is roughly a foot across. It's quite smooth, it's circular, and it goes straight down all the way through to the bottom. Now, the official explanation for that is, oh, yes, well, the early natives here must have drilled a hole to plant a tree in. Anyway, the explanations are becoming more and more ridiculous as time passes. So I now have a university team set, and we're going over next month, and we're hoping to start excavating properly. Remember, there's about 300 plus of these structures over there. And I've located several of them. They all have the same concrete in it. And we're now going to drill into that, find out what's happened to these this metal object underneath. It's shaped like an ice cream cone. Fascinating stuff. Okay, now at about the same time this was all beginning, a fellow in Copenhagen, beautiful city, named René Olsen enters the picture. Now, I'd never heard of him either. He's an artist. He has a very interesting website, but he's also into UFOs in a major way. And he thought, why don't I get these old photos taken when George Adamski had his contacts and colorize them? Now, you can do that now with a fairly good degree of accuracy. And so he got in touch with Fred Steckling of the Adamski Foundation in California, and he began colorizing these photos. So here's one of the photos that some of you will be familiar with, but you haven't seen it before in color. It makes it a lot more real. This is after the extraterrestrial craft had left. That's the group gathered around. George Hunt Williamson is kneeling there making the plaster of cast of the footprints. In fact, that's George's wife here on the far left. So this is about an hour after the encounter that they had all witnessed of this man. So he did this, René, and then he got another idea. I wonder sometimes where these ideas are coming from. He thought, well, if we've still got the original negatives taken on that day, such as this one, why don't we bring them up to date, scan them into a computer, and improve the clarity? So he did so. And to say that what emerged was beyond his expectations is a severe understatement, because blurred parts of those photos, and some of them are washed out parts of the images, now reveal what no one has seen since those photos were taken back in 1952. Now, let me just give you one little glimpse. Top right is the photo that many of you will have seen in the Adamski books. That one actually has been enhanced. This one here has been enhanced and colorized. Nothing is added. These details are all there in the original photograph. Okay, so you can actually see two of the balls underneath the graft. This was as it was coming down. So he began scanning and improving the resolution and the contrast in these other photos. And then I got an email from Michel Zirger that Orthon had been captured on film. And of course, at first, you know, I was still up here with this whole thing on the Isle of Pines, And now Orthon is in a photograph. It was seen too fantastic, but the image is there. And there's no doubting its authenticity. It's a photo that's been around for decades in public view and long before any digital manipulation became possible. So all he's done is clean up the image, improve the contrast, doesn't change any of the original pixels of the scan, but it gives us a view, a higher resolution that shows details. Now, what appears in these photos are just amazing. In the sky now appears the mothership. So the mothership is captured. No, I don't have a photo of it. I'm not allowed to show you most of these photos. The mothership is visible, and beneath the mothership, which is cigar-shaped, like the other photos that you've seen and which I'll show you in a minute, is a dark area, just as the witnesses described, from where the craft seemed to originate. There's the craft itself, the discs, the bell-shaped craft coming down, and also small circular blobs of light, which we think might be some sort of monitoring probe. So it's now become quite clear to us that even Adamski was unaware of all that he had captured with his camera. And most excitingly, of course, is a photo where there's a man clearly visible from the waist up walking towards Adamski, and you can see his long hair, you can see the high collar, you can see the wide belt, and you can actually see his features quite clearly, exactly as Adamski and the other witnesses reported. So let's not forget that Adamski produced many other photos, and none of them to this date have ever been disproved. They've been attacked and mocked, but none of them have ever been proved as fake. So I just want to show you some of them because some of them are not well known. This is one of the earlier photos when he first started. He was given a telescope and started first by looking at the moon. So that's a photograph of the moon with an array of lit objects flying across the face of the moon. He did several photos like that. There's another one. There's another one. There's another one. That one's actually passing in front of the sun. And then, of course, photos that many of you will have seen already of the mothership. And this is very much like the photo that now appears in the enhanced photos for the first time. So these were taken at night. This is a mothership, and notice where the craft are emerging. One is out and another one's just starting to emerge. That's where the dark area is in the new photos. More of them are out. Notice another one emerging down there. So as he takes the photos, the one up in the top left has moved during the exposure, so it's moving at fairly high speed, so it's elongated. And more. And of course the one that I'm sure almost all of you would have seen before, one of the craft close up looking below, showing the 3-ball landing gear. And of course other people in different parts of the world, including England, have photographed that same craft. And orthographic projection shows that it's the same dimension, the same relative size and angles. Another one. And then at the very end of his life, the famous movie that was taken in Silver Springs, Maryland. I don't know how many of you have actually seen the original movie. I haven't got it to show you. But this was kind of like a finale because Adamski died just a few months later. But this was a sighting with a witness present in addition to Adamski of a craft that comes and hovers. We know roughly the dimensions of it, and it changes shape in some way because of the force field around it. So, what to make of all this? There are many, many more stories that appear in different places. Now, I don't know if any of you have met Tony Brunt in New Zealand. Has he been over here? Highly recommend him. He's a long-time newspaper reporter, and I'll be talking about a book that he's done in a few minutes, but he was involved when Adamski visited New Zealand in 1959, and then Adamski came over here. Does anyone apart from Brian, was anyone here who saw and met Adamski? Listened to him speak? Okay, well, we're going to listen to him speak in just a minute, very briefly. But you put all of these stories together, and some of them are just hearsay, but a very coherent picture emerges about young blonde men with long hair who are always mysteriously around. Now, Tony himself, when Adamski flew into Auckland, a strange, well, he wasn't that strange that he attracted attention initially, but a young man, and everyone thought he was a friend of someone else and so on. Afterwards, they realised that he'd vanished and no one knew who he was. And then this pattern continued right throughout his tour of New Zealand, and then it continued when he flew over here to Australia. There was a strange woman who was often seen with him. In fact, a certain ufologist here in Australia fell in love with her. So I'm guessing she was quite attractive. Unfortunately, his wife didn't have the same opinion. There are the stories that some of you might have heard about how when Adamski and his family migrated to America from Poland, and Adamski was about 4 years old, that a man who became known as Uncle Sid helped the family and became almost like a godfather to Adamski. And that Uncle Sid, arranged for him later, supposedly to go to Tibet for several years. Maybe. But what is certain is that there are other things that happened that tell us that we're not talking about your average Joe. Okay, this is someone who had a destiny. One of them was the fact that Desmond Leslie, on the left, Lord Desmond Leslie, he was a cousin of Winston Churchill, went over. He was so entranced by the story of Adamski, he went over and spent several months with Adamski to find out for himself whether this was all true. And he revealed later in life that Adamski had shown him his navel, and he had a huge, very deep sunstone shape carved into his navel, which I think a lot of people have never heard. Adamski was married to a lady called Mary Shimbursky, and again, we don't have any surviving photos, not even a wedding photo, but she believes she was a reincarnation of someone who had lived on Venus, and that's why she was his wife. While Desmond Leslie was in Palomar, in California, with Adamski, he saw craft. He saw monitoring probes flying around with different colours. later on, when Adamski was touring Europe and England and speaking, Leslie saw him off on a train in London and saw an alien man sitting, who was clearly extraterrestrial, sitting in the train in the privately booked compartment waiting for Adamski to board. We have the testimony of Lou Zinstag, a woman from Austria. She was a cousin of Sigmund Freud. Interesting how these people seem to be well connected. But she travelled with Adamski for years and was very close to him as he toured in Europe. And she found that these two young men were visiting his hotel every morning, and she later, at one point, got to see one of them close up. Later on, she went to the opera by herself and encountered two of them, and there was a connection, a telepathic connection that she's written about. So again, there are some fascinating books out there about Adamski that have not yet penetrated the UFO mindset, and they need to. And I've just mentioned about Tony Brunt and his experiences of when Adamski. Most of us will know that the names given to Adamski's aliens were mostly invented by his ghostwriter, an interesting woman called Charlotte Blodgett. But did you know that Adamski told several of his closest associates that Venus, Mars, and Saturn were not the real origin planets? Okay, I can see a few open mouths here. Okay. So I learned a while back now not to get distracted by the fact that Venus has a hellish atmosphere. It's still possible that they may have come from Venus living underground or in some other dimension of it, but Adamski's on record to more than one person as saying that those were not the real origin planets. Okay, so now I'm going to play a very short interview where we can hear the voice of Adamski, and I regret that I never got the chance to meet him or listen to him.
Very glad to be here. A little chilly to what I have been accustomed to. It has gone a little cold, hasn't it? Never mind, it'll warm up perhaps tomorrow. Now, you've just phoned in from Australia as part of your world tour lecturing on flying saucers. You claim to have spoken to people from Venus, and your recent book, Inside the Spaceships, you say you've made a journey. Now, are these facts correct?
They are correct. They're facts, and they'll stand as facts for a long time, I believe.
Now, a great many people believe in the existence of flying saucers, but few, if any, have had the experiences that you've had. Now, can you tell me, where did you first meet a man?
Well, out in the desert, Mojave Desert, 1952, on November the 28th.
And you've met him since?
I've met him since, and I'll go a little further. I've also flown around the moon.
Have you really?
Yes.
I think that's it. Yeah. Anyway, I hope that gives you just a little bit about, a little bit of a concept about what the man was like. Adamski wasn't a perfect person. Is anyone here perfect? Put up your hand. Oh? Okay. Well, we can see that perfection is very rare. Okay. Adamski was not perfect. He had a lot of flaws, warts, and he did go off the track later on in his time before coming back. very distinctive. He was what I would call a character. Now, I mentioned Tony Brunt a few minutes ago, the journalist in New Zealand. Tony has written a book. Oh, okay. I'm going to show you the book cover in a minute. Tony has written a book about Adamski that is the closest thing to a biography of George Adamski. And in a minute, I'm going to show you, I'm giving everyone a free copy of it. It's a PDF that Tony has made available to us today. I think this is called value adding. Even other aliens came to listen to Adamski speak, so I just want to show you a couple of photos. At one of his lectures in California, at Mount Palomar, hundreds of people would turn up, okay? At one of the lectures, there were 3 rather odd people who attended. And as Adamski was talking about, you know, how some of these people live among us, the people in the crowd began paying attention to these 3 people in the crowd. It was a lady, that's her there, and 2 young men. And the crowd kind of turned on these 3 people and said, "Why are you here?" And they replied, well, the woman did all the speaking, and she replied rather straightforwardly, "Because we're interested in this subject." Are the UFOs real? Yes, they are real. Do they come from Venus? Yes, they come from Venus. And so on. And so the conversation went. And people tried to take a photo of them, but they were very shy, did not want to be photographed. Now, the conference lasted 2 days. So the next day, the same crowd of people were back, and these 3 strange individuals were still there. And a reporter from a South American paper, it was either Argentina or Brazil, succeeded in taking a photograph of the lady and of the young man. I don't have the young man here today, but this is a photograph of the lady, and she's only just over 5 foot tall, which you can't really tell in that photo there. But he was able to get a photograph of her, and that's the other photograph that he took of her. Now, I don't know about you, but to me there is something definitely strange about her. But she called her name Dolores, and to this day has never been seen since. Okay, maybe she's just a lady called Dolores, but anyway, a lot of people for a long time have been trying to track her down. Anyone seen her lately? No? Okay. All right, so here's a picture of Tony Blunt from New Zealand, and if you can get him over here sometime, I'll give him a report about how you people are such a fantastic group of people, and I'm sure he comes over here often, and when he does, you can get him to speak. Now, the book that Tony has written is called George Adamski, The Toughest Job in the World. Now, this is a warts and all biography. It addresses the claims that those of us who have read about Adamski over the years have found ridiculous. And it does a good job in presenting a balanced view. So you're all welcome to download a PDF of this. All you do is go to the association website and to the event today's event, and you click on this book cover, which is there. When you click on it, it will open up the PDF. It's not a big book, but you can then open it. So is that clear to anyone? If not, see Paul. But anyway, it's now on the website. Thank you very much, Marie. Now, to tie Michel Zirger's contribution in to the present time, he's now issued a final book. Well, I think it's a final book. It's called Authenticating the George Adamski Case. Now, this has just been released. I actually came here today with 6 copies. Unfortunately, they've all been taken. But it should be available on Amazon. If it's not up already, it will be very, very soon, like I'm talking about days. Okay. And this is more or less a forensic examination of the photos. It includes the photo of Orthon, the original photo in black and white, plus a colorized version. So you can look at that and then think back and see what you think about the man who appeared in Tokyo in the restaurant and communicated telepathically. So, what does it all mean, really? And I'm glad for some of the comments that were made this morning, earlier today, about Mariana. The reality and the truth about UFOs and aliens comes down, for me, to this, and I think Mariana would agree. Firstly, we have never, ever on this earth been alone. Secondly, the speed of light is no more a barrier than the speed of sound was, and the speed of a steam train before that, and the speed of a horse before that. Thirdly, Earth has always been watched over and helped by, pay attention to this phrase, the people of other worlds. Now, that phrase is not mine. That comes from Professor Herman Oberth, O-B-E-R-T-H, who is rightly regarded now as the father of space travel. German scientist. He was the forerunner to von Braun. And when he was asked how have we come about some of these rapid developments, he said, we have been helped. And the reporter said, helped by whom? And he said, by the people of other worlds. Note, he didn't say E.T., he didn't say aliens, but the people of other worlds. Number 5, the human form is universal. We are connected to them. Some of them are our ancestors, and that, of course, is a whole huge aspect of this. Their influence on humanity throughout history has been more profound and deeper than any of us, even us, realize. And some of them live among us right now. No, I'm not one of them, in case you're wondering. But some of us have met them and have visited their worlds. And all along they have nudged us forward towards a better future without direct interference. Poverty, hunger, and unequal wealth distribution on this planet will end as soon as the cover-up does, and the elites are forced to release the advanced technology they have hidden from us the last 60 or more years. I remember Stanton Friedman, who many of you will have seen speak over the years, one of our great researchers, nuclear physicist, and he talked about how when he was working in the US Navy, they had a nuclear reactor the size of a basketball that could churn out unlimited power for as long as you wanted. And yet such a thing is not available to the people. And we have people on this planet to this day who still live in huts, who make do with fires, who, you know, have dirt floors, don't have communications, don't have electricity. All of that will change when the cover-up ends. Finally, I'd like to just introduce some other photos. I want to show you some of the photos that over the years I've collected of actual people from other worlds. This was a lady back at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, known as Maria Orsich, but some good reason to believe that she wasn't from around here. Howard Menger was a contactee at the same time and just after George Adamski, had encounters with many of the same people, with many of the same group that Adamski did. He's passed away, not because I went to interview him, but his wife actually is still alive, living in the States, and he used to hold his little meetings. Now this is a meeting in 1958 in New Jersey. It's an outdoor meeting. And several extraterrestrials attended that meeting. And I recently tracked down this photo. It's the first time I've seen this particular one. It's like an overview. Now, more familiar will be this photo where these three individuals, the two men, the man closest to the camera, the man next to him, and the blonde woman there, supposedly from Venus, but extraterrestrials. And again, no one's been able to track them down over the years. This is a man who's involved with a series of contacts still ongoing in Italy, a man called Maurizio Cavallo. He goes by the name of Suel. That's a young lady from the same planet, Clarion. And this is a photo from, I think it's 1949, thereabouts, and that is supposed to be an extraterrestrial who was embedded into US military engineers, a group of engineers talking there, who helped with some of the assistance. And those of you who are familiar with some of the whistleblower claims, I, for the life of me, don't understand why we don't look into these more carefully and why we don't realize the implications that come from them. Now, I mentioned the amicitia, friend case in Europe, centered in Italy. This is one of the extraterrestrials. They've been able to work out his height. He's around 8 to 8.5 feet tall. A lady called Paulo Harris, that many of you will know of, has written extensively about him. This was a photograph taken of him. Looks quite normal, except his head looks slightly smaller than you would think. But he's just dressed in ordinary casual clothing. And that's a close-up of his face. So what do you notice when you look at these photos? Did anyone see an intelligent amoeba floating around waving its tentacles? Did anyone see a stick insect on its hind legs discussing and discoursing about relativity? Incidentally, I love stick insects. I wouldn't mind having one I could talk with. But all these photos, including the photos from Adamski, all the cases I've talked about have one thing in common. They're humanoid. They're human people. They've got 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. And everything's pretty much in the right place. Just minor variations in height, colour and features, but variations of the universal human form. Now there may be, quite possibly, what we call reptilians. Perhaps they're even alien stick insects, insectoids or something. But what comes across when you look and have your mind open and look at the whole array of reported contact, one thing comes across is that the vast majority, at a minimum, the vast majority of intelligent species are humanoid. And this is one of the great realities we have to get out there. So please don't come up to me afterwards and say, but Warren, I saw this creature and it was pure evil, and it had wrinkled skin and it smelled bad too. They are the exceptions that prove the general rule. Now, a couple of messages in closing, and then if we have some time, I think we do, we can have a Q&A if anyone wants to say anything or ask any questions. Let's not any longer suspend everything in ufology, in our work, in our groups, while we await disclosure, okay? If it was on the alien agenda, or the agenda of the people of other worlds, I should have said, it could have taken place at any point like that. They could do it. In fact, they've come very close with some of the sightings of Mexico City. They're seen by hundreds of thousands of people, photographed, daytime, videoed, mass sightings of craft. And that was, at the time, the largest or second largest city on the planet population-wise. Disclosure will come for the general public, but my message is that we can achieve disclosure ourselves right now and move beyond it. We already have all the tools to do that. Now, Mariana, by everything I've heard today, has done a superb job in setting up and building up this group. And so she's obviously got left some big boots to follow, but I only met Marie today for the first time after some contact by email, and my impression is that she's up to it. Okay. We have the tools to end disclosure. We don't have to wait for someone to do that for us. We can do that ourselves. The alien presence, or the presence of the people of other worlds, is not intruding into our reality. It is, and always has been, our reality, a part of it, an integral part of it. As Philip Corso tried to tell us from his first-hand experiences behind the scenes, the simple truth is that we are literally at the birth of a new age. So in a world that's drowning with trivia and distractions from reality, thank you for being here and not being at the footy or down the beach. I'm sure the weather had nothing to do with it, but thank you for being here and embracing the challenge of finding reality, because we are the leading edge of the change. Thank you.